This is a photograph of the Benjamin Noble at the Conneaut, Ohio docks on the morning of April 22nd, 1914. As you can see in the image, her freeboard, that's the distance between the waterline and the deck, is dangerously low because she's carrying 2,900 tons of steel rails, roughly double what a vessel her size should have been hauling at the time. You don't need to be a sailor to look at that photograph and know something's wrong. Just one good wave and water's pouring over that deck. The dockworkers at Conneaut that morning watched her load up with a mixture of amazement and dread, knowing she was headed north to Duluth across the unpredictable waters of Lake Superior. But she went anyway. And just like those dockworkers feared, that photograph became the last time anyone saw the Benjamin Noble afloat. To understand what happened to the Benjamin Noble, we need to talk about her captain, John Eisenhart. At 31 years old, Johnny Eisenhart was one of the youngest masters working the Great Lakes in 1914. He'd worked his way up from the bottom, deckhand, wheelsman, mate, and the Noble was his first command, his very first voyage as captain. Born in Milwaukee to a family that had worked the lakes for generations, Johnny had practically grown up on the docks, and he'd earned his master's certificate by 26. Years earlier, he'd survived a shipwreck near the Manitou Islands, the only man to make it off that boat alive after clinging to a life raft for hours in freezing water. He knew what Lake Superior could do to you if you weren't careful. The Benjamin Noble herself was built in 1909 at the Detroit Shipbuilding Company in Wyandotte, Michigan. She was the only vessel owned by the Capital Transportation Company, where J.A. Francombe served as both president and manager. At just over 239 feet long and 40 feet wide, she was what they called a canaler, designed specifically to fit through the narrow locks of the Welland Canal and the St. Lawrence Seaway. Her triple expansion steam engine put out 800 horsepower, driving a 12-foot propeller that could push her along at about 11 miles an hour when she was loaded. She wasn't fancy, but she was built to haul heavy cargo cheaply. And during her first few years of service, she'd carried everything from pulpwood to scrap iron to coal. What made the Noble different from most lake freighters was her self-unloading capability. She had lifting booms mounted on 2 masts that could swing cargo in and out of her 7 hatches without needing dockside equipment. It was slow work, but it meant she could load or unload anywhere there was a pier, which gave Francombe a competitive edge when bidding on contracts. And in the winter of 1913-14, Francombe had been hustling for contracts like his life depended on it, because frankly, it kind of did. The American economy was in rough shape. Hundreds of thousands of men were out of work. Sailors, dock workers, factory hands, all of them scrambling for whatever jobs they could find up in Massillon, Ohio. General Jacob S. Coxey was planning his second march on Washington with an army of unemployed laborers. The only bright spot that winter had been Henry Ford's announcement on January 14th that he was raising the minimum wage at his factories and cutting the workday to 8 hours, which sent shockwaves through American industry. While Ford's workers celebrated, his competitors were furious, calling him reckless and worse. But Ford's business was booming, and everyone else's was failing. For the shipping companies on the Great Lakes, the situation was desperate. Demand for iron ore, coal, and limestone, the basic ingredients of steel, had dropped off a cliff. Most of the big freighters sat idle at their docks all through what should have been the start of the shipping season in April. their owners too nervous to even fit them out for departure because there simply wasn't any cargo to haul. The few managers who did send their ships out early were gambling that economic conditions would improve, but mostly they were just grateful that the mild winter had left the upper lakes nearly ice-free. The Benjamin Noble was one of those gambles. Frankham had spent months lining up a contract to haul steel rails, 300 railcars full of them. Manufactured by the Cambria Steel Company and destined for a railroad contractor in Duluth, it was a huge contract, the kind that could save his one-ship company if he could deliver it fast and on schedule. The problem was that the Noble wasn't big enough to carry it all in one trip, not safely, anyway. When Captain Eisenhart arrived at Conneaut, Ohio on April 16th and saw the rows of railcars lined up along the dock, he reportedly turned to a dock worker and said the cargo looked like enough for 2 trips. But Frankham insisted they could manage it in one, and he made it clear that future contracts depended on a fast, successful delivery. For a first-time captain in the middle of an economic depression with hundreds of experienced, unemployed masters looking for work, that wasn't a suggestion. It was an ultimatum. Loading took 6 agonizing days. The Noble's booms lifted the steel rails bundle by bundle, stacking them in layers separated by wooden blocks so they could get slings underneath when it came time to unload. Each rail, after being hoisted and carefully maneuvered into the hold, had to be pried into position against the ones before it with crowbars. Wooden chocks were wedged along the sides of each layer to keep the cargo from shifting when the ship rolled, and Eisenhart, knowing his modestly sized vessel would pitch violently in heavy seas, used a lot of dunnage, blocking between the rail ends and spacing blocks to keep the steel from hammering itself to pieces. It was back-breaking, tedious work, and with every load that went into her holds, the Noble settled lower in the water. Her normal loaded draft was about 17 feet. When she hit that mark, Eisenhart showed no sign of concern. Layer after layer went down, and then another. The water crept up to the maximum draft line marked on her hull and kept climbing, inch by inch. By the time they were done loading, she was drawing 18 feet. And there were still 2 railcars sitting on the dock. Eisenhart finally called a halt. He couldn't take any more. Those last 2 cars would have to stay behind because their weight would sink the ship too deep for safety. The situation didn't escape the notice of the dock workers operating the cranes nearby. They'd been watching the loading process with growing amazement as the rails kept going aboard. A dock foreman reportedly told Eisenhart that the ship looked dangerously low in the water. The captain's reply was evasive. The foreman only recalled him saying something to the effect that he'd hug the shore and everything would be fine. But another dock worker, overhearing his boss repeat the captain's words, was more blunt. "Well, he ain't going far on the lake," the man shot back. Someone even took a photograph of her at the dock on April the 22nd, amazed at how her freeboard had essentially disappeared under the weight of 2,900 tons of steel. The Noble finished loading on the evening of April 21st. Eisenhart announced they'd cast off the following morning, but the overnight delay was necessary because a larger steamer would be using the dumping machine all night. By now, the entire crew had assembled around the ship, men who were equally unhappy about the overloaded condition, but who needed to collect their gear, get paid, and look for other work. Except it was the spring of 1914, and aside from Captain Eisenhart's vessel, there weren't any other voyages waiting for them. Chief Engineer A.C. Koger from Port Clinton, Ohio, must have been acutely aware of the situation. This was his first voyage as chief engineer, and he had no desire to fail at this major responsibility. He must have felt the Benjamin Noble could make the trip without undue risk, because otherwise he wouldn't have allowed his own son, Frank, to come aboard as an oiler. The firemen Otto Gunch and William Gullett, both from Toledo, were veteran sailors, as was Paul Belaski. The second engineer, steward John Conan, and second cook Thomas Proud had worked together on several steamers and were well aware of the ship's condition. Maybe they all agonized over what to do. They weren't men who could easily walk away from a ship. Doing so would probably blacklist them from future employment, so not a single man left the vessel. For Eisenhart, the decision was even more brutal. He could resign and notify Frankham of his intention, but it would take enormous courage to do that before he'd even completed his first voyage as master. The economic conditions were savage. Hundreds of unemployed captains were wandering the docks looking for work. Plenty of them would welcome the chance to take over the Noble and wouldn't give a damn about the risks Eisenhart was facing. Frankham could easily find another captain, and Eisenhart would probably never get another chance to command his own ship. The word unreliable would stick to him forever. And even if the circumstances were never made public, just the fact that he'd abandoned ship would sow serious doubts in the minds of future owners that he didn't have the backbone for command. So here's what Eisenhart was facing. He was 31 years old, finally getting his shot at the big chair after years of grinding his way up through the ranks. He'd survived one shipwreck already and knew exactly how fast things could go wrong on the lakes. He was staring at a vessel that was visibly, dangerously overloaded, sitting so low in the water that dock workers were taking pictures because they couldn't believe what they were seeing. He had a crew of 16 to 20 men depending on him to get them safely to Duluth and back, and he had an owner who was betting his entire company on this one voyage, who'd made it crystal clear that backing out now would mean the end of Eisenhart's career before it really began. What would you do? Walk away and spend the rest of your life wondering if you'd thrown away your one chance? Stay aboard and hope the lakes would be kind to you. Hope that your skill and experience would be enough to compensate for the 200 extra tons of steel riding too low in your holds? There's no good answer to that question, and Eisenhart knew it. On April 25th, the Noble reached the Sioux Locks, the gateway between Lake Huron and Lake Superior, before heading out into the open water. Eisenhart wrote a letter to his sister. In it, he admitted he was frightened about the final leg of the journey. He knew the ship was dangerously overloaded. He wasn't naive, wasn't pretending everything would be fine. He was a young man who understood exactly what he was risking, and he wanted someone to know, just in case. But he sealed that letter, gave the order to proceed, and pointed the Benjamin Noble north into Lake Superior, carrying her crew and a cargo that should never have been loaded in the first place. Before we follow the Noble out onto Lake Superior, we should probably talk about what made her different from other lake freighters, because that difference matters. The ship was what sailors called a canaler, and if you're not familiar with Great Lakes shipping, that term might not mean much to you, but it's important, because it explains a lot about why she was in trouble before she ever left the dock. When the Benjamin Noble was built in 1909 at Wyandotte, Michigan, she was designed specifically to navigate the Welland Canal and the Street, Lawrence Seaway. Those waterways had much smaller locks than the modern ones, tight squeezes that limited the size of vessels that could pass through. So canalers were built narrow and compact, usually under 250 feet long and no more than about 43 feet wide. Dimensions that let them slip through those restrictive passages and reach markets on the Atlantic coast that the bigger lake freighters couldn't access. The problem was that Francom and the Capital Transportation Company weren't using the Noble for canal work. They were running her on the open lakes, where she had to compete with much larger vessels and face weather conditions she wasn't really built to handle. Canalers had a reputation among sailors, and it wasn't a good one. They were considered wet ships, meaning their decks were constantly awash in heavy seas, and they pitched and rolled more violently than the bigger boats because they didn't have the mass to power through the waves. What made the Noble especially vulnerable was her architecture. Unlike most lake freighters, which kept their deckhouse low and streamlined, the Noble had her after cabins mounted on a raised poop deck at the stern, and her forward cabins sat on a raised forecastle deck at the bow. This elevated design kept the crew quarters above the cargo holds and made life aboard slightly more comfortable in calm weather. But it also meant the main deck, the spar deck, sat much closer to the waterline than it did on conventional freighters. When the Noble was properly loaded to her normal draft of 17 feet, she had about 4 feet of freeboard, which is the distance between the waterline and the deck. 4 feet doesn't sound like much, and it wasn't, but when she was overloaded to 18 feet, like she was in April of 1914, her freeboard shrank to almost nothing. The photograph taken at Conéo shows it clearly. The water is lapping at the deck edge, and you can see why the dock workers were so alarmed. One good wave would send water cascading over those rails and into the cargo holds if the hatch covers weren't absolutely secure. The Noble had 7 cargo hatches running down the length of her main deck, and they were designed to handle awkward, oversized cargo like steel rails, lumber, and stone. But those hatches were also points of vulnerability. If water started pouring over the deck in heavy seas, it would pool around the hatch coamings, the raised edges around each opening, and if the wooden hatch covers weren't properly battened down, water could work its way into the holds. And once water gets into a ship's cargo spaces, especially when she's already riding low, things can go wrong very quickly. There's one more detail about the Noble's history that's worth mentioning, because it suggests she might not have been in the best shape even before this fatal voyage. On October 14, 1912, the ship was involved in a collision near Detroit that caused her to take on water. 6 days later, she limped into Superior, Wisconsin, with 54 hull plates damaged. The repairs were extensive enough that she had to be laid up for a while before she could return to service. We don't know if those repairs were done properly or if they might have left weak points in her hull, but it's another factor that didn't help her odds when she headed out into a spring storm on Lake Superior, carrying twice the cargo she should have been hauling. When the Benjamin Noble left Conéo on the morning of April 22, 1914, Lake Erie was calm, almost deceptively peaceful. Captain Eisenhart had to know the ship was riding dangerously low in the water, loaded with 2,900 tons of steel rails that left her with maybe 4 inches of freeboard. But that morning, the weather gave him no reason to panic. The lake was smooth, the sky was overcast but quiet, and the Noble pushed north toward the Sulocks at her painfully slow crawl, 7 miles per hour if she was lucky. By the evening of April 25th, they'd reached the locks at Sault Ste. Marie, that narrow gateway between Lake Huron and Superior. This was where captains usually picked up weather information, swapped stories about conditions ahead, made the decision to push on or wait it out. The word around the docks that evening was unsettling. Storms coming, people said, might be a bad one, but there were no official storm warnings posted yet, no gale flags flying from the signal towers, so Eisenhart made his choice. The Noble would continue. Here's the cruel trick that Lake Superior played that night. The storm warnings went up just minutes after the Benjamin Noble passed through the locks and disappeared into the darkness. If Eisenhart had been delayed by even a few minutes, if the lockmaster had been slower, if anything had gone differently, he would have seen those red flags snapping in the wind and known to find shelter. Instead, he steamed directly into what meteorologists would later identify as a nor'easter, one of those perfect combinations of atmospheric violence that the Great Lakes specialize in creating. The storm hit with a kind of fury that even experienced captains found unnerving. First came the fog, thick and disorienting. Then freezing rain that turned the deck into an ice rink. And finally, the wind, gusting well over 60 miles per hour and pushing waves that survivors from other ships described as mountainous. These weren't the rolling swells of the open ocean. These were steep, close together walls of water that came at you fast and angry, the kind that don't give a ship time to recover between hits. Down in the engine room, Chief Engineer A.C. Koga was fighting a battle that nobody on deck could fully appreciate. The Noble's single propeller was 12 feet in diameter, driven by an 800 horsepower steam engine that should have been more than adequate for a ship her size. But when you're riding that low in the water and the waves are lifting your stern clean out of the lake, that propeller starts spinning in air instead of water. And if you don't adjust the engine speed fast enough, the whole system can tear itself apart. Koga had his son and his brother down there with him, all three of them working to keep the engine running smooth while the ship pitched and rolled, while the propeller alternated between biting into solid water and screaming uselessly in foam. Meanwhile, back up in Superior and Duluth, the storm was tearing the shoreline apart. Wind snapped telephone poles like matchsticks, ripped the roofs off buildings, and at the coal docks in Superior, actually knocked over the massive steel trestle structures that held up the loading equipment, sending tons of machinery crashing down onto the pier below. At the entrance to Duluth Harbor, the storm blew out the South Pier light, the kerosene lantern that marked one side of the narrow channel. A dock worker named Stan Standen ran out onto the pier trying to relight it and was swept into the churning water by a wave. His body was never found. And somewhere out on the lake, in the darkness and the snow squalls, two ships were running for their lives toward that darkened harbor entrance. The Norwalk and the Benjamin Noble had been traveling together since the Sulocks, the Norwalk staying just behind the steel ship. They were roughly the same size. The Norwalk actually a bit longer, but there was one critical difference. The Norwalk was built of wood and carrying a much lighter cargo. When those massive following seas came rolling up from behind, the Norwalk could lift and ride over them, her wooden hull flexing slightly, her lighter weight letting her dance across the tops of waves. The Noble couldn't dance. With 2,900 tons of steel rails in her hold and almost no freeboard left, she had to smash straight through every wave that came at her, taking the full force of thousands of tons of water directly onto her deck. It was like the difference between jumping over a fence and running straight through a brick wall. Both ships were moving forward, but only one was being slowly beaten to pieces in the process. By the afternoon of April 27th, Captain Frank Goodrow of the Norwalk could see that the Noble was in serious trouble. She was falling behind, struggling to maintain any forward momentum against the waves, and when the Norwalk finally pulled ahead and passed her, Goodrow could only watch as the steel ship disappeared into the snow and spray behind him. He hoped, probably prayed, that Eisenhart would make it, but hope doesn't count for much on Lake Superior when the weather turns. At some point in those final hours, Eisenhart must have seen the lights of Duluth ahead and realized he had a problem. With the South Pier light out, there was only one light visible at the harbor entrance instead of two, and in the snow and darkness, it was impossible to tell which light was which. If he guessed wrong about where the channel was and drove his ship into the breakwater, he'd end up like the Mataafa, the freighter that had smashed into the Duluth Pier just a few years earlier in similar conditions. Some historians think Eisenhart tried to turn back, tried to run back out into the lake to wait for daylight or clearer weather. If he did, that turn killed him. A ship that heavy, riding that low, turning broadside to those massive waves. It would have taken just one good hit to roll her over or swamp her completely. One wave over the side, water flooding into the hold through those barely secured hatches, and the Benjamin Noble would have gone down in minutes. The witnesses that night saw pieces of what happened, glimpses through the snow and spray that only made sense years later. A woman in Duluth, watching the storm from her window, saw a ship's lights struggling out on the lake and then suddenly vanish after a particularly large wave. Her daughter called shortly after, said she'd heard a ship's whistle, desperate and faint, cutting through the roar of the storm. Captain Millen of the Daniel J. Morrell, a massive 609-foot freighter that was big enough to handle the storm, reported seeing two sets of lights near Knife Island around 3 in the morning. He watched them struggle, watched them rise and fall in the waves, and then one set of lights simply disappeared. He assumed at the time that the ship had just been hidden by a snow squall, that she'd reappear in a few minutes. She never did. The Norwalk made it into Duluth Harbor at 4:30 that morning, her crew exhausted, her wooden hull battered but intact. Captain Goodrow expected the Noble to show up an hour or two behind him. By noon, when she still hadn't arrived and no one had heard from her, he knew. Everyone knew. The Benjamin Noble was gone, taking Captain Eisenhart, Chief Engineer Koga, Koga's son and brother, and 17 other men down into the dark water off Knife Island. No distress calls, no lifeboats, no survivors, just a cargo of steel rails that Superior had decided to keep, and 20 families waiting for men who would never come home. The storm didn't care that it was 1914 and ships were supposed to be safer now, built of steel instead of wood, powered by modern engines instead of sails. It didn't care that the Noble was only 9 years old or that her crew included fathers and sons working together. Superior has never cared about any of that. When the lake decides to take a ship, it takes it, and the only question left is whether anyone's watching when the lights go out. For 90 years, the Benjamin Noble was a ghost story. One more name on the long list of ships that Lake Superior had swallowed without explanation. Families mourned, insurance companies paid out claims, and eventually the world moved on. The lake kept its secret. Until the fall of 2004, when a team of shipwreck hunters got lucky in the way that only happens when you've already stopped looking. Jerry Ellison, Craig Smith, Ken Merriman, and Randy Beebe were after a different ship entirely, a wooden freighter called the Robert Wallace that had disappeared in 1886. They'd been running sonar sweeps for days off Knife Island, mapping the lake bottom in systematic grids, finding nothing but rock and mud and the occasional abandoned fishing net. This was their last pass of the season, literally the final run before they had to pack up the equipment and head home for the winter. And that's when something appeared on the screen that shouldn't have been there. The sonar signature was wrong for the Wallace. Too big, too angular, definitely not wood. They dropped an underwater camera down through 306 feet of dark water, and when the lights hit the wreck, they knew immediately this wasn't what they'd been looking for. Steel hull, mechanical debris, and when the camera panned across the cargo hold, there they were. Thousands of steel rails, still stacked in neat rows exactly where they'd been loaded 90 years earlier. The Benjamin Noble had just announced herself, sitting upright on the bottom like she'd been waiting patiently for someone to finally show up. But it was how she was sitting that told the real story. The Noble hadn't just sunk. She'd plunged into the lake bed with such force that her bow had carved a trench 60 feet long through the mud before she came to rest. Imagine the physics required to do that. A ship with enough downward momentum to plow through the bottom like a knife through soft earth. This wasn't a ship that had slowly filled with water and settled gently to the bottom. This was a ship that had gone down fast and hard, pulled under by the weight of all that steel in her hold while the water above her was still churning with storm waves. The aft cabins had imploded from the sudden pressure change. Their walls collapsed inward in a way that only happens when a ship descends too quickly for the air inside to equalize. The crew quarters, where men had been sleeping just hours before their shift. The galley, where the cook had been preparing meals. The captain's cabin, where Eisenhart had written that letter to his sister, worrying about the overloading. All of it crushed by the weight of the lake pressing down. The hatch covers that had washed ashore in 1914 were gone, leaving the cargo hold open to the current, and scattered around the wreck site were the small personal artifacts of a working ship, ventilation pipes, the broken-off stern mast, and one of the lifeboats lying alone in the mud, never launched, never even close. The wreck confirmed what Captain Millen of the Daniel J. Morrell had seen that night in 1914 when he watched those lights disappear. The Noble had gone down almost exactly where he'd been looking, just a few miles short of the safety that Duluth represented. She'd been so close. And she'd taken everyone with her. Somewhere between 16 and 20 men died that night. The exact number is uncertain because this was the first run of the season and the complete crew manifest was never filed. Most of what we know about who was aboard comes from newspaper reports and family records pieced together over the decades. Captain John Eisenhart was 31 years old, from Milwaukee, a young officer being given his first command and trying to prove himself capable despite his private fears about the ship's stability. First mate George R. Longley from Niagara Falls left behind a family in St. Catharines, Canada. Cook John Colnan and Thomas Proud were both from Oswego. Fireman William Goulet and Otto Gunch were from Toledo. But the cruelest loss was the Koga family. Chief Engineer Alvin Koga, his brother Joel Koga, and his son Frank Koga all went down together in that engine room. 3 generations of the same family working side by side when the water came flooding in. Joel had been engaged to be married. Frank was following in his father's footsteps. Learning the trade, Alvin had spent those final hours fighting to keep the engine running while the propeller alternated between biting water and spinning uselessly in air, doing everything he could to give his captain a chance to reach port. They died doing their jobs, and they died together. There were reports after the disaster that bodies had been found on a reef somewhere, but that turned out to be false information, probably confused with casualties from another wreck. The truth is that none of the crew of the Benjamin Noble were ever recovered. They're still down there at 306 feet, entombed in what's left of the ship they'd trusted to keep them safe. The discovery of the wreck in 2004 didn't just solve a historical mystery about where the ship had gone down, it confirmed what Eisenhart had suspected in that letter he sent from the Sulocks. What he'd been too professional or too afraid to say directly, the Noble had been dangerously overloaded for profit, pushed beyond her safe limits by an owner who cared more about maximizing cargo than maximizing the chances his crew would come home. The ship had been riding with only 4 inches of freeboard, and when the storm hit and those massive following seas started coming over the stern, there was nowhere for the water to go except down into the hold. Superior took the Noble, because the Noble never should have been out there in the first place. Not loaded like that. Not in April, when the storms are unpredictable and vicious. Every shipwreck is a tragedy. But some are also a crime, and the line between the two is measured in inches of freeboard and the decisions of men who never had to face the consequences of their own greed. In 2007, the Benjamin Noble was added to the National Register of Historic Places, officially recognized not just as a shipwreck, but as a gravesite and a warning. The lake had kept her secret for 90 years, and when it finally gave her back, it gave us a lesson that's still relevant more than a century later. There's always someone willing to cut corners for profit, and there's always going to be workers who pay the price when those corners get cut too close. Lake Superior is still out there, still cold, still unforgiving, and still holding secrets we haven't found yet. Every spring when the shipping season opens, captains make the same calculations that Eisenhart made: how much cargo, how much risk, how much faith to put in steel and steam against water and wind. Most of them make it, some of them don't. And the lake never explains why it chooses one ship over another. If you want to hear more stories about the ships that didn't make it and the people who went down with them, subscribe to the channel. There are hundreds more wrecks out there. Hundreds more crews still waiting 300 feet down for someone to remember their names. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.